faith, firearms, freedom. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio. This is episode 12. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran. This episode brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made, custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. CooksHolsters.com. I just got back from Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I shot my first IDPA match of the 2016 season at the MVSA Regional, the Mountain Valley Regional Championship. The Mountain Valley Sportsmen's Association is in the middle of nowhere in the Hot Springs National Forest, and if you follow your GPS to get to the range, it will either send you down one of several dirt roads that either will end in a gated hunting property or will be some winding, muddy track that will have you worried you're never going to get out of there. The one that actually does connect and gets you to the range, I don't remember the name of the road, it starts out paved, and my GPS has an avoidance option, and one of my options is avoid unpaved roads. Well, the road starts out paved and then turns into a single lane gravel goat path, essentially, that tends to wash out in the rain. Last year was really awful because it had rained for most of the week leading up to the match. There were big ruts in the road where the rain had washed it out and parts of the road had fallen away, and I was seriously worried. It was dark and it was drizzling on the way in. I was really kind of worried that I wasn't going to get out of there. It was muddy, and I was driving my Hyundai, which, if you're driving a big four-wheel truck or an SUV, it's a little easier, but I could have sworn at one point I heard the theme from Deliverance and I got a little worried. I'd heard stories of people actually bending the rims of their tires trying to traverse that road, and I believe it. This year was a little better. It didn't have the rain leading up to the match. There were a couple of places where you had water standing, and I saw evidence that other cars had gone through before me and had apparently made it successfully, so I wasn't quite as worried this time. But I actually tried a couple of different routes. Knowing what the GPS was going to try to do to me, I tried to go different directions and have the GPS reroute me, and each time it took me to dead ends, and I ended up having to take that dirt road anyway. Finally got there. The match was a lot of fun last year, and if you go to the website, look at the blog, I wrote about the Mountain Valley Regional last year. Every stage had a theme. It was based on a show from the History Channel. There was Pawn Stars, there was Axemen, there was Yukon Gold, Amish Mafia, American Pickers. Well, the targets were all close. The shooting was fast and instinctive. There wasn't a lot of gimmicks. Along with the battle in Benton, Arkansas, it was my favorite match of the year. And this year was a little different, but it was still the same sort of shooting. Really fast, really instinctive. I never heard a cover call the entire day. Everything was very straightforward. You could make a plan and stick to it. There weren't a lot of gimmicks, a lot of gotchas where they tried to make things arbitrarily more, complicated just for the sake of making them difficult. It was really a lot of fun. The match went from a Tier 2 match last year, I think it was, to Tier 4 this year, so there were a lot more shooters. A lot of new shooters who hadn't been to MVSA previously, so I wasn't the only one driving down the goat path this year. The stages didn't have a theme this year, but they were still very, close targets, fast, and fun. There were some typical stage designs, the kinds of things you might have seen at other matches, but with some interesting twists. For example, probably seen a lot of different, matches where you start facing or stages where you're facing a bad guy of some sort. You're either, hands at surrender or hands at your sides. You draw and you shoot while retreating to cover, and then you move down a wall in one direction or another and engage targets from behind cover through windows or around doorways. Well, stage 1 was like that, but the difference was that the scenario suggested that you got shot while engaging those first 2 targets. So you had to hold your side and then engage the remaining targets for the rest of the stage, strong hand only. That was fun, and you saw some shooters kind of have a little difficulty remembering, oh yeah, I got to switch and shoot strong hand only. And then there were some who said, well, if I'm going to have to shoot strong hand only for halfway after the first 2 targets, I might as well just shoot the whole stage strong hand only. So that was kind of cool. Every match I've ever been to has got a restaurant stage, where you're sitting at a restaurant, you've probably got a fork and a knife in your hand, and you're seated at the table and bad guys show up, right? Well, MVSA put the same sort of stage in, but they had their own twist. And the twist was that you kick the table over. They put the table on hinges and some padding down so you could knock the table over, and then you could drop to one knee or 2 knees or whatever, crisscross applesauce, whatever you want to do. Use the table for low cover and engage the targets. That was really cool. Every match has a house entry stage. You come home and you find bad guys ransacking your house, or your family's in danger, or whatever. Unfortunately, most of those stages are very kind of rudimentary, and you have to sort of imagine the house because they're set up with some sort of screens or netting to imagine the walls. In this case, you actually had the front of a building with a window and actual door, and you weren't shooting through portholes in walls. You actually had an entryway and a big room with furniture and non-threats and moving targets, which was pretty cool. One stage had you start on your back underneath an actual car they had propped up on jacks, and you were supposed to be changing the oil when the bad guys show up on the other side of the car, and you had to roll over, retrieve your gun and your magazines from a toolbox, and then engage the targets under the car. That was kind of that was challenging. That was kind of cool. Last year, MVSA actually made the standard stage fun. I hate standards. A lot of people do. Most people do. Standard stages are just basic sort of tests of your shooting skill. They're not scenarios. There's nothing fun about them. They suck. Okay, let's just get that out there. But last year, MVSA made it fun and actually had a scenario built into the standard stage. The first string, you're working at a pawn shop. It was actually called Pawn Stars. You're working at a pawn shop when bad guys show up. So you draw your gun and you engage the 3 targets, strong or freestyle, and then somehow in the shootout you get injured, right? So the next string you have to use your strong hand only, and then the next string, for some reason your strong hand doesn't work because you got stabbed or something in that encounter, and the bad guys came back a third time, and this time you had to shoot them weak hand only. So they had a little scenario to it, and it wasn't just three targets sitting equal distance apart. They were all in different. Each string was at 3 different stations, 3 different distances, and it was a kind of a scenario stage with the standards built in, and it was fun. Not so much this year. It was your basic 3 strings of shoot 3 targets twice each, weak hand only, then strong hand only, then freestyle, all while moving, then a 4th string of headshots, and it sucked. but that's had nothing to do with MVSA. I'm not blaming MVSA. I just don't like standard stages. That was also my first stage of the day. And speaking of first, it was my first match wearing my sponsored shooting gear. So thanks to Cook's Holsters. They're the primary sponsor, and their logo's on the front of the shooting shirt. Also to Blue Bullets, their logo's on the back. It was my first match of any kind shooting my TriStar P120. It's basically a clone of the CZ75 SP01, only it's $200 less expensive, which means I can trick it out a little bit with grips and sights and still be less than the cost of a stock CZ75 SP01. It was also my first time shooting my own ammo. I got the reloading bug back in February and got me a progressive press for my birthday, so I made use of my Blue Bullet sponsorship and pressed out some ammo for this match. And another first, I was I went to the range the weekend before and was testing out some of that new ammo and practicing a few of these stages. When I got back, and I guess it was Tuesday, before the MVSA match, I was cleaning my gun and realized the front sight had fallen completely out and was gone. I could not find it anywhere. So I had to rush around and ordered a high-vis fiber optic front sight from Amazon. It was the only thing I could get quick enough. Got it installed on, I guess it was Thursday. Did not have a chance to get to the range to test it, to figure out, if my point of aim had changed. So it was my first time really shooting with those sights, with the combination of my, rear sight that I had already been shooting with and this new front sight. It seemed to work out pretty good. The point of aim seemed to be about the same. So my accuracy was not impaired any, and actually accuracy was pretty good, with the exception of the disastrous first stage. The rest of the match was I felt pretty good about. The first stage, I had a lot of problems with primers. I'm guessing it was probably they were probably seated a little too high. I had 6 malfunctions on that first stage, plus a procedural penalty because I ended up, stopping. I think it was the first string. You had to advance and shoot weak hand only, and I think it was the second pull of the trigger where the first malfunction happened, and I stopped cold and did a malfunction drill and then fired another shot, and I was flat-footed when I did that, so that cost me 3 seconds. Plus, by the end of the stage, I was 41 points down, plus the procedural error. All of that in the first stage, and I got all of my errors and screw-ups out of the way in one stage. 41 points down. I was 68 points down for the entire match. So I went 11 stages, 28 points down for the next 11 stages. Got 41 in the first stage. It was awful. I had a couple of procedurals later in the match, one on stage 4, one on stage 5, the car stage and that restaurant stage that I mentioned earlier. They changed up the number of shots required. They went from 2 shots on most of those were the only 2 stages where they required 3 shots each, and my brain just didn't pick that up. And so I started shooting them 2 shots each and then picked up procedural errors for that. And then there were a couple of mental mistakes trying to make up headshots that I didn't need to, and that cost me a little bit of extra time. But overall, shot pretty well. Worked through my game plan on every stage, didn't deviate from the game plan. And despite that soul-crushing first stage, I really had a lot of fun. I was squatted with really an awesome group of people, a foursome from Iowa that made the trip south for the match, including my friend Scott Longhorn and Billy Wideline, whom I'd shot with before. Great shooters. The whole group was really good and really fun to watch them shoot. A couple of Arkansans, I guess you say it. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. They're from Arkansas. I'll just say that. And a couple of Texans, good people, good shooters, none of them too serious. They just were approachable and fun and just fun to shoot with. I heard tell of one shooter on another squad. I don't know whether he was a master class shooter or an expert shooter, but he apparently was upset with the way he shot the match that he immediately stormed off and left after the match was over. Completely forgot that he brought somebody with him and left that guy stranded at the match. That's really good. But these people were not like that. They were just down to earth, an absolute joy to shoot with. I really enjoyed it. So my first match of the season is done. Now it's on to Perryville, Arkansas on April 16th for the Arkansas State Championship. That's in 2 weeks. If you're going to be there, be sure to say hi. All right, enough about me. Let's get on with the show. On today's episode, Sergeant Bill is bringing us another of his ballistic minutes with tips on trigger control. Aaron Israel from Fundamental Defense is back with a personal defense tip about practicing off-balance shooting. And Pastor John Bennett has returned to bring us our Clinging to God and Guns segment. We'll take a look at some misguided Christian anti-gunners who seem to think the Old Testament prophets Micah and Isaiah calling us to beat our guns into garden tools for the third world poor. All of that is straight ahead on Armed Lutheran Radio.
Pistols, prayer, and potluck. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill Silvia.
This is Sergeant Bill. Today's topic, trigger control. When I think of trigger control, I think of a triangle with your stance and your grip on the bottom of the triangle, the bottom corners, and on the very top is trigger control, pressing the trigger. So stance is the base, it's your foundation. Your grip is the control. It's how you control the gun, control recoil, control where you're aiming. The trigger press is number one, it's the most important. The trigger press is the action or the activator, the activation of your pistol. It's on top because it's the most important, because you can have a bad stance and a good grip, or you can have a bad grip and a good stance, or you can have a bad stance and a bad grip. But if you have a good trigger press, more than likely you're going to have a good shot. It influences your shot, your sight picture, the most out of those three fundamentals. Now, the first thing you need to do is you need to learn your trigger press of your particular gun. By learning it, I mean you need to learn where the wall of your trigger is, which is when you're pressing the trigger. Most triggers, whether it's a single action, a double action only, or whatever it may be, it's going to have a little bit of take up, and it's going to come to a spot where it's going to get a little bit heavier just before the trigger breaks. That is the wall. You need to learn where in your trigger to feel that wall, where it's at, so that you can get right to it. You can practice that without even looking at the sights, just having the gun basically not even in your line of sight. You're just going to press the trigger till it gets to that wall, to just before it breaks, and then let it loose and then do it again. By practicing that, you'll learn where the wall of that particular trigger is. There are many different schools of thought on trigger press, how you should do it, how you shouldn't do it, pin and reset, prep and pull. There's lots of different ways that people have come up with how to do it. I pretty much, in my experience, have boiled it down to three basic trigger presses. The number one is the slow press or the surprise break. That's what everybody thinks of that when they're first taught how to shoot a rifle or a handgun or whatever it may be. You're slowly pressing the trigger back, you're pressing it straight back, and you want it to, when the trigger breaks, it should surprise you. Well, if you've already learned where the wall of your trigger is, it shouldn't surprise you. But that's how most people get the most accuracy, by doing a slow trigger press all the way back and just having it break when it breaks. The second is what I call prep press. You're prepping the trigger, you're pulling it back to right about where that wall is, and then you pause there for any amount of time you feel necessary to get your sight picture where you want it, and then you're pressing it through. This is probably not as accurate as a slow press, but with practice can be extremely accurate. The third is what I call the fast full press. Some people call it sweeping the trigger or slapping the trigger. I don't really like the term slapping the trigger because that denotes that terminology is most firearms instructors or just shooters will use as if you slap the trigger, you're not hitting the trigger properly, you're not activating it properly, you're pressing it off left to the right, or it causes a lot of bad things. So think of it as sweeping the trigger. So what you're going to do on that fast full press is you're going to take your finger from out of the trigger guard, and it's going to go straight to the trigger and go and quickly, very fast, you're going to sweep through the whole trigger press. You're going to roll right through it really quickly. It's the fastest, but probably the least accurate. But with practice, just like any of the others, it can be very accurate as well. Now, if you have several different guns, practice with the several different guns. If they have different triggers, all the better. I practice with single action 1911s, safe action Glocks, some of them that are stock, some of them that are not stock triggers, double action only pistols, double single pistols that I have, and even revolver triggers. They're all going to be slightly different, but you can learn with a little bit of practice where the wall is on each one of these, and you can practice those 3 different types of trigger presses so that you will be able to control that trigger and make that gun go off when you want it to and how you want it to. The key to trigger control is practice. Like I said, first you got to learn where the wall is, and then you just got to practice. You know, the slow prep press, that surprise break, may be for using for longer shots. The prep press may be middle range distance shots for you, and then that trigger sweep or the fast full press you might use on targets that are really close and you're shooting really fast. Some instructors will talk about a pin and reset technique, and there's lots of different names for it, but basically what it is when you pull the trigger, the firearm goes off, you pin the trigger all the way back as it goes off, you hold it there, you get back on your sight picture, and then you're letting the trigger out only to the reset. A quick little thing that you can show that this is not a very fast trigger technique: put your hand flat on a table, take your index finger and try to tap it at a fast pace as far as you can raise your finger up, and then try to do it with only allowing your finger to go maybe a ½ inch off the table. They're going to be about the same speed. It actually takes a lot more discipline, a lot more practice, and is a lot more difficult to make that finger go just a short distance, just to only go to the reset of that trigger. It may be more accurate, but it takes a lot more work, and I don't find that it works for me. Give it a shot. Maybe it works for you. Above all, practice. You got to practice if you want to be good. You got to practice if you want to be competent. So you determine your level of practice, you determine your level of competency. This has been your Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill. Keep on practicing.
Remember, Armed Lutheran Radio comes with a 100% satisfaction guarantee. If you are not completely satisfied, the next episode is free.
And welcome back. It's time now for a self-defense tip from Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense.
Hey folks, Aaron Israel with Fundamental Defense here with your personal defense tip of the week. This week I want to talk to you about putting yourself off balance when you practice for personal defense. When I see most people practicing with their defensive handguns, I see them getting into a perfect stance, staging their firing hand for the perfect holster presentation, taking a deep breath, and then waiting for the buzzer or the command to fire, and then trying to execute a flawless string of fire with a high level of precision on each shot. That's what I like to call range choreography. This type of practice can be helpful if you're preparing to shoot a very specific course of fire, such as a class of fire for IDPA or USPSA, but it isn't going to be very helpful at preparing you for the context of a defensive shooting. Defensive shootings usually start as ambushes, meaning that you are likely to be caught off guard and still expected to apply the necessary skills to get accurate hits and stop the threat. In that context, you are going to be as out of the zone as you possibly could be. So if all you do is practice in the zone with choreographed range drills, you really aren't developing your skills in context as well as you could be. A good way to think about defensive shooting is to think about the last 2 seconds of a tied basketball game during March Madness, since that's what's on TV right now and that's what's on my brain apparently. Imagine that you just went to the sidelines with your teammates and the coach chose a play to try and get the ball to your best shooter so that he could try and sink the three-pointer to win the game. Now imagine that when that pass is inbounded, that it comes to you instead of to the best shooter, and you are forced to take that three-point shot to win the game with zero preparation beforehand, zero anticipation. That's pretty close to what it would feel like to find yourself in an ambush situation for personal defense. You may have the mechanical skills to hit the three when you're playing basketball, and you may have the mechanical skills to get accurate hits on the threat in the context of shooting, but you're just likely to have zero anticipation when you need to do it. So you're not going to have any idea when and where you're going to have to apply those skills. So if you think about it that way, if all you're doing is essentially running a certain play or shooting free throws, so to speak, when you practice with your defensive handgun, you really aren't doing what you ought to be doing and preparing for a worst-case scenario. There's drills out there that are designed specifically to make you process information, move athletically, apply your defensive shooting skills on demand within the limits of the square range. In the defensive focused shooting program that I teach, we use a drill called the figure eight drill, where we have you walk in a figure eight around 2 cones with several targets arrayed at different angles and distances downrange. Each target has a number painted on it, and when the number is called out, you have to identify your target, present your gun from the holster while you're moving off the line of attack, and get good accurate hits to stop the threat. You can Google the figure eight drill and find some YouTube videos of what it looks like. You don't have to be that fancy though. You can do something as simple as having targets with different shapes or numbers that you can have your training partner call out in order to force you to find a target and engage it without knowing beforehand what you're going to be shooting at. You could take a can of spray paint and spray paint different shapes and circles, different numbers on the target, even if you don't have sexy targets with shapes and stuff on them. You can get creative and make it so that you have to process information, find what you're shooting at, and apply your defensive shooting skills on demand without a high level of anticipation. Whatever you're going to do, try to get creative with your defensive handgun training and put yourself as out of the zone as possible when you practice. Getting really good at running static range drills only prepares you to shoot those static range drills. Push the limits of the square range and try to develop your skills in as much context as possible. It's very doable. There's a lot of drills out there. If you check out personaldefensenetwork.com, there's a lot of drills that Rob Pincus has developed around this concept. And you can also come out and take a class with us. Find us on the internet at www.fundamentaldefense.com. And thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time, and try to make your range practice as in context as it possibly can be.
If you carry a gun for personal protection, it's imperative that you get a good holster. When I started out, I had no idea what that meant, and I went through a bunch of really bad holsters. Then I found Cook's Holsters at cooksholsters.com. Cook's Holsters are custom made to fit your specific firearm. Available in lots of colors, including custom printed Kydex. Cook's Holsters are made in the USA and the great state of Georgia and come with a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and get a 15% discount off everything in the store. You put a lot of time and money into the firearm you choose to carry for personal protection. Carry it in the best holster. cooksholsters.com.
Welcome back to Armed Lutheran Radio. Time now for another edition of Clinging to God and Guns with Pastor John Bennett. Pastor Bennett rejoins us for a little bit of fun here with an article from Red Letter Christians called America's Gun and Heart Problem. Welcome back, Pastor.
Thank you. Pleasure to be back.
All right, let's get started. This is from Shane Claiborne from October of last year, so it's relatively recent. This was in response to the shooting at the Umpqua Community College in Oregon. So here we go. This week's tragedy struck Oregon as 26-year-old, I'm not going to mention his name, massacred 9 people at Umpqua Community College And this week marked the anniversary of the Nickel Mines massacre in Pennsylvania. Both are reminders that we have a crisis in America. We have 4.4% of the world's population, but almost half of the civilian-owned guns. I didn't source that. I'm not sure where that one actually came from.
I've come across this before, and it's pretty close. We've got 42% of the world's guns, so America winning once again.
That's right. I'm trying to... What is the source for this? Oh, it's Vox. That ought to tell you something. In just the last 3 years, we've had nearly 1,000 mass shootings, and there's that statistic, which there's no real good definition for what a mass shooting is. So, of course, the left basically uses whatever definition fits their political agenda.
Right. Well, and what's interesting, too, is that many of these mass shootings, they are committed by it's cases of gang violence like what we see in Chicago.
Right. And it also includes familicides. So you've got, murder-suicides. That counts as a mass shooting, which certainly shouldn't. It's not the same thing as, say, Newtown or the Umpqua Community College shooting or even the Nickel Mines massacre. It's, some guy who loses his mind, gets depressed, and decides to kill his whole family. Completely different thing.
Right.
Killing over 1,200 people and wounding over 3,500. There is a mass shooting almost every day in America with 4 or more victims. In fact, we hold the Guinness Book of World Records for the most guns, nearly 300 million guns. Yay, America. Again, I think that's a win for us. But anyway,
yes.
That's 90 guns for every 100 people. The runner-up is India with 4 guns for every 100 people. We have a problem. Over 11,000 murders a year and about twice that many suicides from guns.
And here's where, I'm trying to be nice. I'm trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But the guy didn't bother to really research his statistics. And actually, we have more than 300 million guns in the U.S. The firearm ownership rate, it's 112 guns per 100 people. He says now, this is where I really can't give him the benefit of the doubt because a quick search will tell you that this is blatantly false. He says the runner-up is India with 4 guns for every 100 people. That's not even close. The runner-up is the country of Cyprus with close to 70. So, and India is way down on the list of ratio of guns per 100 people. It's the rank. I'll tell you real quick. India rates number 107 out of 175 nations. So it is well in the bottom third of the number of firearms owned per 100 people. But just taking a look at his comparison, though, and this really gives you a perfect example of how these statistics actually weigh against arguments in favor of gun control. India has approximately 1/25 of the number of guns per capita. But India has a murder rate that's not much different than the U.S. The U.S. has 3.8 murders per 100,000 people. India has 3.5. So the authors also makes this big deal about, there's 11,000 murders a year. India, it's about 43,000.
Right.
So it's just a perfect example that the analogy actually demonstrates that firearm ownership is inconsequential to the murder rate. By the guy's rationale, we should have a murder rate of almost 100%.
Well, this is what happens when you get your statistics from Vox. Some will argue guns don't kill people, people kill people. The fact is, people with guns shoot people. Sometimes they shoot themselves. The areas of the U.S. that have the highest concentration of guns also have the highest concentration of bloodshed.
That's false.
That is completely wrong. let's take a look at the major murder centers in this country are the places like Chicago, which have horribly restrictive gun control laws, and yet their violent crime rates are out of this world.
Right. There is a clear, concise corollary between the restrictive level of the gun control laws and the rate of violence. You take a state like Texas, your state has a relatively low rate of violence. Certainly there's still violence within the big population centers.
Right.
But in comparison to the number of people living there, you have a much lower homicide rate, say in Houston or Dallas, than you do in Chicago or Oakland or Detroit.
Right.
Or Washington, D.C.
Right. Oh, well, Chirac hadn't come out yet when this was published, I guess. So he wasn't aware of it. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
Perhaps.
Right. There's a powerful image in the Bible where the prophets, both Micah and Isaiah, speak of God's people beating their swords into plows, turning their weapons into farm tools. It's an image of transforming the tools that have been used to destroy life into tools that can be used to cultivate life. A number of prominent leaders in the first few hundred years of Christianity pointed to this image of beating swords into plows as evidence by which you would know those who follow Jesus. They insisted that Christians are meant to fulfill that prophecy as the ones who follow the Prince of Peace. Just as Jesus transformed the cross, a terrible instrument of death, into a symbol of life, so Christians are to turn from death to life, interrupting everything that destroys life in this world.
With exception of those last few words, speaking of Jesus turning the cross into a powerful symbol of life, that is such horrific BS.
Don't hold back now.
I'm trying to choose my words carefully. I am not aware of a single quote unquote prominent leader in the first few hundred years of Christianity that has so thoroughly perverted the reference in Scripture of beating swords into plowshares. This is a complete perversion of Scripture, the way that he applies this. And to see why, let's take an actual look at Scripture. So he mentions Isaiah and Micah. And actually this imagery of turning plows into, or swords into plowshares is used 3 times, once each in Micah and Isaiah. And the context in both passages is very similar, and the context is also very clear. This is a perfect example of completely ignoring the context. To use that term that we coined a while back of putting Jesus in a box.
Right.
Well, since it's the Old Testament, we'll say putting God in a box. So let's take a look at these actual verses, and I'm going to quote from Micah chapter 4. It says, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. But everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. For all people walk each in the name of his God. But we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever." Now he takes these words and twists them to try and say that even some of the leaders in the early church use this as, well, people who do this are suddenly fulfilling these prophecies. Wrong. These verses, they're not a prophecy regarding how God's people are going to suddenly become pacifists. These are messianic prophecies.
Right.
They are describing a spiritual and eternal reality that will be accomplished by the coming of the Messiah. Very appropriate for us to be discussing right after Easter.
Right.
But what's more is that these words were used in contrast to the nearly constant state of war that God's people were in. So the prophets are more or less saying, now you are in a constant state of war. But when the Messiah comes, he will bring about an eternal reality of peace. So we
Right.
really can't apply these verses in any way to temporal affairs because they aren't being written in that manner. They're written in such a way that they are prophetic messianic passages about the eternal reality that the Messiah would accomplish. In essence, that by the Messiah coming, when our lives are ended, we enter into eternal peace with him.
Right. And
Now go ahead, I'm sorry.
so there can't be peace on earth until he comes. We live in a fallen world, so we're going to experience violence and war and bloodshed until the day of his return.
Right. And what makes this even clearer is that the verses specifically say that you will not learn war anymore. It's speaking of a time where there is no violence whatsoever. The only reality in which we find that is a reality without sin.
Right.
In other words, heaven. But here's where it gets interesting. Those are the first two. I mentioned that there are 3 times this phrase is used.
Mm-hmm.
And this is from Joel chapter 3. Listen carefully. Tell me if you catch what's different here. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for war. Wake up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong.
Well,
Did you catch the difference?
wait a minute. That's entirely in reverse.
Yes, and this is what is conveniently ignored by our author here, is that in Isaiah and Micah we have examples these are messianic prophecies referring to the eternal reality of heaven, the salvation that is won for us by Christ on the cross. Joel is speaking of a temporal reality, that as part of our reality in this world, war is also included in that. So he's saying, prepare for war, turn your plowshares into swords. So when we this is a perfect example of why whenever we are taking a look at God's word, we have to also take a look at the context. The context is speaking in Joel chapter 3 of the end times when there will be great turmoil in the world, especially for God's children. Right. So this idea that somehow we have a command from God to take our guns and beat them into gardening tools truly is a blasphemous perversion of God's word.
Again, like you said, putting God in a box, making God fit your political agenda.
Yes, and the thing that also bothers me here is that with examples like this, when we have people who claim from a Christian perspective to provide this interpretation, in many ways they are insulting the intelligence of their audience because they are assuming that their readers aren't going to look into this for themselves, that they are going to be so naive as to simply take them at their word.
Well, unfortunately, they're probably right.
Indeed.
So back to the article. Certainly we Christians have lost sight of that vision over the centuries, and we have often been the ones carrying the guns rather than the ones beating on them. Christians have sometimes exchanged the cross of Christ for the sword of Rome or the guns of America. Lord have mercy. But there's a group of Christian blacksmiths who you might consider fundamentalists of the best kind, because that's a nice jab, because they are taking these swords to plows verses literally. These metal workers known as raw tools, raw is war turned around after all, are literally forging peace. They take donated guns, AK-47s and handguns, and they heat them up in a forge and beat them into oblivion.
Well, and the stupid part of this,
What?
they say that by doing this, they are forging peace. I don't see the peace.
How's that working out?
It's not. Especially just on the back of the terrorist attacks in Brussels, Iraq, and Pakistan, their efforts obviously have been gone unnoticed by the radical Muslim terrorist world.
they would have been better off to pack those guns up and ship them to the Christians in the Middle East.
Indeed. And, what's also so irritating about this, part of it, of course, I understand it's their ideology. They want to destroy guns. They then take these and they turn these into tools for people to use in poor third world countries. They didn't include that in the article, but I read that on the organization's website. If you want to provide low-cost tools for people living in the third world, take the donated guns, sell them, and you can probably buy 100 times the number of tools.
Yes.
There are plenty of law-abiding citizens who are going to use those firearms responsibly.
Yeah, and you'd make so much more money for this worthy cause if the goal was really helping poor people in the third world, which it's not.
No, and purely as a matter of law, these guns wouldn't be, for example, quote-unquote machine guns, as the liberals like to call them, because guess what? They couldn't lawfully even hold those firearms unless they were with a federally licensed dealer.
Right.
So it's I would like to see the guns that they're doing this to. I'm guessing they're a bunch of old high points that no one wanted.
Those things won't melt down. I've teamed up with them over and over. Something just feels right about taking some of these 300 million guns and beating on them. I've beaten on guns alongside victims of gun violence who lost their kids, alongside police chiefs and activists, and alongside a woman named Terry Roberts. She's the mother of the man responsible for the nickel mine shooting 9 years ago. There's something incredibly moving about seeing Terry pick up a hammer and beat on the barrel of a gun. But it wasn't just about the gun. Terry Roberts is a living witness that God is transforming hearts, not just metal. Well, that may be true, but it's not through the action of beating on the gun that God is doing the work.
Right. And I have a serious problem with that, because what is the author implying here? He is implying here that a person's heart is transformed by God when they then have the desire to pick up a hammer and beat a gun just like he has.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to skip through the next paragraph because it's just kind of boring and people will fall asleep and stop listening. As Terry and I beat on a gun together earlier this year, she reminded me that we don't just have a gun problem, we also have a heart problem. We need God to transform both our hearts and our nation. As we beat on the barrel of that gun, it felt like we were participating in the redemptive work of God, in healing hearts and healing streets, beating guns into plows, turning hatred into love.
First, I would say, yes, we do have a heart problem. However, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this segment, comparing the murder rates between India and the United States, as well as the firearm ownership rate, that the heart problem is not a direct correlation to the quote-unquote gun problem.
Right.
We would have this heart problem still if we had no guns, because we have sin. As long as we live in this world, we will have to deal with the reality of sin. That means that people will still have the desire to kill each other.
Right.
When Cain killed Abel, he didn't need a weapon. He just grabbed a rock. So it's not that we have a quote-unquote, well, even though I say, yes, we have a heart problem, in the sense that we have a sin problem.
Right.
But where I really take offense is where he says that I felt like we were participating in the redemptive work of God in healing hearts and healing streets.
But they're not.
No. And that is so offensive to Christ, because he is the one who does the redemptive work by letting sin be nailed to his body on the cross.
If we could do the redemptive work, we wouldn't need him.
And if we didn't have him, we would all be eternally lost. But this argument is so upsetting to me, because it essentially takes the entire argument of gun control and tries to equate it to Christ's work for us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. As we lament the horrors of massacres like what has happened this week in Oregon and 9 years ago in Pennsylvania, let us refuse to choose between false dichotomies like
the ones he uses.
Like the ones he uses. The fact that we have a gun problem and we have a heart problem. The fact is that we have a gun problem and we have a heart problem. It is my prayer that God would heal our heart problem and some of our politicians would have the courage to help heal our gun problem.
It's the old liberal mindset that a gun makes a reasonably sane and law-abiding person suddenly turn into a wrathful, vengeful, murderous menace.
Right. The gun is some sort of an evil talisman that turns people otherwise good people evil. Meanwhile, we're not going to wait on politicians to turn death into life. We cannot wait. We've got pruning hooks to make. I added that, sorry. The beautiful thing about the vision of the biblical prophets is that it is the people themselves who start to transform their weapons. That doesn't happen. Yeah.
No. And we completely debunked that too. That this is prophetic of
if anything,
what
Joel
Messiah is going to accomplish.
If anything, Joel has people doing the opposite. That's eventually the nations follow and study war no more. Show me where that has ever happened.
I would say the nation that decides to study war no more is the nation that is begging the surrounding nations to conquer it.
Mm-hmm. The people of God can't wait on politicians, but instead they take the hammer into their own hands. Or the hammer and the sickle. So we're going to keep heating up the forge and inviting folks around the country to bring your guns and beat them into oblivion. After South Africa's revolution, Nelson Mandela told the people of his country, "Throw your guns into the sea." I couldn't believe they brought Nelson Mandela into this.
Yes.
That guy was a terrorist.
By his own admission. And look at and if you're going to bring up South Africa, look at their murder rate. Right. South Africa, I just looked it up. The murder rate of South Africa is 31.9 murders per 100,000. If you round up the United States, rounding up that is, it's 4. So more than 8 times the murder rate. Obviously, Nelson Mandela, your strategy doesn't work.
Today, as massacres continue almost daily, we have had enough death. We are saying to America, bring your guns to the forge and let's beat them into plows. We have grown tired of death.
He talks about massacres occurring daily, and I can't help but think of the recent massacres that have existed both in Paris and in Belgium. And Paris, very strict gun control.
Absolutely.
The terrorists used guns primarily as the tool of murder.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't stop them.
Nope.
And in Brussels, there was recovered AK-47s at the scene at the airport.
Right.
It didn't stop them.
All right. Well, thank you for joining me again. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We'll be back together next week. We've got an interesting one from Christianity Today. Thank you all for listening, and tune in again next week for another episode of Clinging to God and Guns here on Armed Lutheran Radio. And that is going to wrap it up for another episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Thank you for listening. Keep shooting, keep praying, and we'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.com. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ArmedLutheran and like us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/TheArmedLutheran. You can contact us by email at armedlutheranradio@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 855-54-ARMED. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.